Hi class, this is the first video recording for Chapter 12, Motor Speech Disorders. So the first thing that I want to tell you about this chapter, hopefully you have already read it. Let me remind you that it is absolutely best practice, my strongest recommendation for you to read the chapters before you listen to the videos, the lecture. I would, if we were meeting in person, expect you to have read the chapter before you come to class. So that is how I design my lectures, with that expectation. So for this one, what I want to remind you of, if you've already read it, you should have figured this out, is that this chapter is not exclusively talking about children. Our last chapter on articulation, speech sound disorders, was really talking exclusively about children. And of course, speech disorders, even of those type, articulation and phonological processing disorders, for example, can carry over into adulthood, but they start in childhood. This class of speech disorders, motor speech disorders, can also start in childhood, carry over into adulthood, but can also have their onset in adulthood. So we're going to be looking at them in a few different ways during this chapter. So I just wanted to make sure you understood that clarification. Now, you also should have seen that I attached a list of vocabulary words onto titanium from this chapter. I'm not going to read those to you. They will be in this lecture. You'll hear the vast majority of them in the content of not necessarily this specific video you're watching right now, but through the course of the videos and into the Zoom part of our lecture. So obviously, if I have taken the time to get that prepared for you, that means those are words that I think are very important that you understand. This chapter, Motor Speech Disorders, is really like almost anything we talk about. It's complex. It's new information for most of you. This is a very neurological based discussion that we're going to have today. I'm sure you can tell if you looked at that vocabulary. So it's important that you understand it. Okay, I think I've gone through my list of all the things I wanted to tell you before I started. So we'll just jump in and I'll remind you again. I'm looking at my notes to the side. So a motor speech disorder occurs when there are defects in the underlying systems with planning and programming and execution of the fine motor movement needed for speech. And because of that, the results of that are a weakness or difficulty in producing fluid, intelligible speech. Okay, I want to make a clarification here. We're going to, in a few weeks, we'll be doing the chapter on speech fluency. Fluency is one of those terms that has overlapping meaning in our field and in many other applications. What I'm talking about in this chapter and in other places in our field is just that easy ongoing flow. When we talk about specific fluency disorders, we're talking about stuttering or cluttering, which we'll come to in that chapter. So when I say here that it results in weakness or difficulty in producing fluent, intelligible speech, I am not talking about stuttering. I am talking about motor, planning, programming, and execution issues that impact how sounds are produced so that speech is intelligible. A motor speech disorder cannot be explained by any other disorder. So such as a language disorder or a phonology disorder, although they can co-occur. And remember in a previous video, probably in last chapter, we discussed the term comorbid. Okay, so a child with a motor speech disorder can also have a language disorder, or for that matter, they can have a stuttering disorder, or they can have autism, or they can have any other variety of disorder. They are not causal. One is not causing the other. So a true motor speech disorder is a disorder all on its own. That doesn't mean the child can't or the adult can't have two presenting disorders. That would be comorbid. With a motor speech disorder, there may, but are not always, also weaknesses in non-speech oral movement. So things like the ability to smile or chew, or use your mouth for other non-speech things. There may be difficult, like to do with eating. It may be difficult to have that same kind of level of motor control. Now, not always. Many times, motor speech disorders only impact speech, and we'll talk about that a little later in the chapter also. The systems underlying speech production. Now, we've talked about these a couple times. We talked about them back in chapter 1, and we talked about them again in the chapter on anatomy and physiology. I can't remember what chapter number that was. The underlying systems for speech production: the respiratory system, the phonatory system, and the articulatory system we've covered before. This chapter will go into a bit more detail on that fourth system that I alluded to back then, the resonatory system. So I am not going to repeat all of that information for you again, but I am going to give you just a little nutshell, bird's eye view. Let's throw all the idioms in there I could think of. A little bird's eye view of each of these systems. Again, please read the material in chapter 12 because there is some additional information about each of those systems that was not covered previously. But again, in a nutshell, the respiratory system controls the flow of the breath stream for both passive breathing and for speech. So it is the lungs and the trachea and all of those various supportive muscle groups. The phonatory system is the system that modulates and controls the airflow in various ways and at various points along the vocal tract to make voice. So it is not the act of breathing, but the act of the system working on that breath flow to produce voice. So this includes the larynx and all of the involved muscles and structures that manipulate the larynx to produce voice. The articulatory system regulates the fine motor control of the articulators within mostly the oral cavity to manipulate the outgoing flow of air in different ways. Now, the reason I said mostly is we know we have an articulatory point in the larynx. That sound is not in the oral cavity, but for the most part, articulatory system is within the oral cavity. Then that fourth system, the resonatory system. This regulates the resonation or the vibration of the airflow as it moves through the pharynx and into either the oral or the nasal cavities. The velopharyngeal port, and I think this is a new term for us in terms of anatomy. I don't think it was introduced in the previous chapters. Velopharyngeal port. So I'm going to spell it. Normally I would have it written on the board behind me. Velopharyngeal. Velopharyngeal port. It is the opening between the velum, or the end of the soft palate, and the back of the pharyngeal wall. And that port is what controls the flow of air between the nasal and oral cavities. So when that port is closed, all airflow comes through the mouth. When that port is open, then we can have airflow and resonation coming through the nasal cavity. So velopharyngeal port. So we have the four systems. Fluent speech. Again, not fluent in terms of are we stuttering, but fluent in that ongoing easy flow of articulatory movement to produce speech. Fluent speech requires the rapid coordination of muscle activity across all of the muscle groups of those four systems, and it needs to be programmed together as a single neurological unit called a motor unit. A single control mechanism that controls all of the degrees of freedom, and I'll talk about what that means in a moment, but controls all of the movement of all of those muscle groups that support the four systems for speech. Okay, there are 6 degrees of movement when we are now, I'm going to tell you right now, you don't need to take notes on this. I just am using this as an illustration so you understand what I'm talking about. Whenever we're describing movement within the body or even mechanical movement, so how a machine is functioning or moves around, Think about a simple machine. Think about a vacuum cleaner. So you can have a vacuum cleaner that has 4 wheels and you just push back and forth, or it has an engine that helps move it. Or you can have like the Dyson ball that has the big ball in the front, and it has a higher degrees of movement because of that ball in the front. Or we think of aircraft or space travel when we talk about the mechanical movement, okay? Well, we have those same degrees of movement to some point when we're talking about muscle movement. So there are 6 degrees, it's called 6 degrees of freedom. And they are simply, and you don't have to memorize these, please, this is just as an example: front, back, left, right, up, down. And then the ones that we're not so familiar with: pitch, yaw, and roll. And those are terms that you would hear in aircraft or in space flight. But it's talking about different movement and how it relates to the stable point. So those movements, this is the part where now we're back to how our brain is programming muscle movement, okay? So this part I need you to know. Those movements that remain constant over repeated productions in different contexts seem to be planned and executed as a whole motor unit, okay? Although the timing and the force can vary across different executions of that movement. So I'm going to try and give you a very simple example of how we program, how a movement is programmed as a whole. Now, I'm not going to use a speech example because I think a bigger muscle example is easier to make this understood. If I had a big yellow playground ball and I was going to kick the ball, okay, this is an experience we've all had. At least I assume we all have. I have not seen you all in person, so I'm going to make the assumption that you are all ambulatory. You can walk and move around, okay? So we're going to kick this ball. Now, let's say I just want to kick it 10 feet away, not very far. It's exactly the same movement to kick it 10 feet as it is to kick it 40 feet. I'm going to pivot my hip backwards. I'm going to pivot my knee backwards and then push it all forward and kick the ball. So back to these movements remain constant over repeated productions, okay? It is the same movement every time I want to kick the ball. What changes is the force and the timing when I want to vary the execution. Okay, so again, if I want to kick it 10 feet away, same movement, I pull back and kick. If I want to kick it 40 feet away, I pull back and kick, but I'm going to vary it by the timing and the force I apply. I may pull back farther so that I can swing and kick it harder to get it farther away, but the essential movement is the same. Now, to give you a speech example of that, I'm sitting here talking to my computer. If we were in class, I'm using about the same vocal volume and the same pressure on the articulators that I would use if I were sitting to some people sitting in the front row. But the reality is that if we were in a classroom and there were all 62 of you, there would be someone sitting in that very back corner over there that I need to make sure could hear me and understand me. So even though my movements, my articulatory movements, would remain the same, even my taking a breath, the way I take a breath for speech and expel that breath for speech, my resonation for the sounds, all of that movement remains essentially the same, except my timing and the force of that movement. So I have to expel air with much greater force to talk to the person in the back of the room. My articulatory posturing might be more precise if I were trying to make sure the person in the back of the room understood the distinctions between my words than it would be if I'm just sitting talking to the person in front of me. So I hope you understand this. So I'm going to read that sentence again to make sure we're understanding. The movements that remain constant over repeated production in different contexts are planned and executed as a whole motor unit, but the timing and the force varies across executions. So speaking involves both linguistic units, so the language we want to use, the way we're going to produce those sounds are the because of the language we're going to use, the sounds that we choose to produce. There's a motor unit plan that's a linguistic unit. But we also have acoustic events in our speech. So the pitch we're choosing to speak at, the variation within the pitch, the loudness. What we don't know neurologically is if the motor unit, this plan, right, this plan that we have as a whole, if it is more closely corresponded to the linguistic unit or to the acoustic event. So is that plan most aligned with the words and sounds we want to say, or is it most aligned with the acoustic event, the pitch and the volume, the loudness we need to speak with? We just don't know. We can't separate that out. But what we do know is that the linguistic system seems to provide information at the cognitive level to the motor system in order to program those patterns of muscle activity into those single motor units, okay? So motor planning and programming. We plan and then we program muscle movement. That happens before the initiation of movement, okay? So planning and programming, all right here at the cognitive level, just getting everything ready. The minute movement starts, we are in execution. Motor execution is right at the time of initiation of that plan, okay? In your book, this is on page 400. There's a good explanation of motor planning, programming, and then that motor execution. Now, there is a little tiny discussion point on page 403 in your book. Excuse me, it is very warm in this room. Page 403 in your book, and it might give you a good example of that variation in pitch and loudness, and how you can just do an experiment for yourself to see that. So it's asking you to ask a friend, sit and have a conversation with a friend, someone who lives in your home, right? Because we're not talking to too many other people these days. But ask them to tell you about the last trip they took. And listen to their variation in pitch and loudness when they get to, oh, this was my favorite part of the trip. Or if they're talking about, well, this part was kind of boring or we had some problems. Just listen to that variation and think about that motor planning and how it has to plan across all of those articulatory, phonatory, resonatory, and respiratory systems when they change the pitch or when they change the loudness, and how that's impacted by those linguistic units, the words they're choosing to use. It's just an interesting experiment. Okay, so in your book, the definitions, I'm not going to read them aloud for you. They're also on that page I provided for you for motor planning, motor programming, motor execution. So I've repeated these now a number of times. You know, these are important terms. But just to give you more common explanation of them. Motor planning. Motor planning are the goals. We have a thought, and the minute we have a thought that we know we are going to say out loud, we start the motor plan. It's the intent of what we want, the intent we're going to share with our muscles to execute what we want to say. Motor programming is how that goal will be met. What is it exactly that I'm going to tell the muscle groups? So let's just talk about one set of muscle groups. Let's talk about respiratory and, well, two sets, respiratory and phonatory. I want to tell the person sitting in the back corner of the room that this is something really important to hear. Are really important to know. So I have to tell my muscle groups, take a deeper breath, build up more subglottal, so under the level of the vocal cords, subglottal air pressure, so that your voice can be louder when you're speaking to the back corner of the room. So I had to have that plan, and then I had to have how the goal is going to be met, what I'm going to tell the muscle groups. Obviously, this is all happening not in my conscious thinking. All right, I got to log back in. Sorry, guys. Otherwise, I can't see what's going on. Okay. By the way, my husband and I have both tried messing with the settings on my laptop so that doesn't happen. I don't even know if you see the screen disappear. You probably don't. You're just seeing me fuss with my computer. And my Mac is just not cooperating. Okay, so we've had planning and programming, and now we have to have motor execution, the actual execution of this planned program. So we plan, we program, and then we execute speech. So from now on, as we talk about planning, programming, execution, we will talk about planning and programming as one unit. Because the reality is, neurologically, even though we know that these are separate events neurologically, they are so tied together that we can't separate them out neurologically. So we're always going to consider planning and programming as one event, execution as the next event. So fluent articulate speech is developed because of extensive practice. This is motor planning. So motor planning, for any of you that play piano, or any of you that dance ballet or jazz or hip hop, any of you that play a sport, you understand practice, right? Practice is so that you can have motor learning. If you, when you play soccer, I'm sure that's an experience that is probably shared by 80% of you. Southern California or more worldwide, soccer is the sport that most kids play when they're little. You went to practice twice a week, right? That wasn't just to get you out of the house. You had a game on Saturday morning. That practice, you think about it, you run drills, right? That practice is to help you with motor learning so that while you're on the field and that ball is coming toward you, you don't have to stop and think, okay, I want it to go to that player over there, so I need to dodge around this side and have this big of a kick. You don't want to have to stop and think about that. Same thing with playing, let's say playing piano, right? You practice scales back and forth and back and forth. And you're never going to play these in a concert, but you're doing that so that your fingers, the muscles movement in your fingers develops this motor learning for how to move along the piano. Then you start practicing separating them out and playing different keys. It's all motor learning. That is exactly how we learn fluent, articulate speech. That's why babies, when they first start talking, we say, up until a certain age, they're 50% intelligible. It's because they haven't yet had enough time with the practice for the motor learning to produce that speech as an intelligible utterance. As they get more and more practice, they're more and more easy to understand because they have that motor learning. Think of yourself. You don't have to stop and think when you are reading aloud how to say that word, unless it's a word you've never read out loud before, right? Then that's more of an issue of decoding the word than it is planning. So speech involves very complex motor movements across all four of those systems, respiratory, phonatory, resonatory, and articulatory, all of those systems at the same time. That is hundreds of muscles moving and coordinating, and we learn that by practice, by motor learning. Well, there are also a number of theories about how we not only learn it, but how we retain it. What does that practice look like for us? And we're going to talk about that in our next video. All right, so stay tuned for video 2.